When it comes to the countries in Southeast Asia, and mainly those countries, for example, Vietnam, the Philippines, and also Thailand, last but not least, the country of Myanmar, have been going this tremendous political and also social changes. Keep in mind, Myanmar is one of the strategic countries in Southeast Asia. However, recently, because of the social and political unrest, drew the attention worldwide. And meanwhile, on February 1st, 2021, Myanmar's military orchestrated a coup. The National League for Democracy's supermajority in the November 8th 2020 election had scared the military, and the unpopular pro-military party was rooted since then. But meanwhile, in this episode, we need to talk about the existing military power and also what about this what we call armed revolution take place in Myanmar today. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to invite our distinguished speaker, which is Uday. Uday is one of the international journalists, and also he is the writer for the MilitantWire.com. Well, Uday, and welcome back to The Missing Piece.
Thanks a lot, Will. It's good to be back here. Looking forward to this.
Well, brother, again, I can tell you how thrilled I am to have this conversation with you. Now, let's get started. Initially, when I discovered you, because you wrote this amazing article, which is called Armed Revolution in Myanmar and 2 Years On. Now, for some of our audience and viewers aren't familiar with the current political challenge and also the social chaos in Myanmar, can you walk us through what happened exactly in this country and why is it concerning at this moment regarding that what you called armed revolution?
Thanks a lot, Will. So let's talk about where the country is at the moment and what's brought it to this point. Myanmar, historically, it had kingdoms and then it was colonized by the British. It was of the Indo-British Empire at that time. The British Empire, sorry. It became independent in around 1948, and it was this kind of budding democracy at that time. Everyone was trying to figure things out. And then the military came into power in 1962 in a military coup. And they pretty much stayed in power till 2011. And in 2015 were the first, open and fair and free elections in Myanmar. And in 2015, the National League for Democracy won. That was led by Aung San Suu Kyi. Now, coming to the 2020 elections, the National League for Democracy does even better than it did in 2015. And this scares the military, which has always held on to power in Myanmar. It's so entrenched in the country historically. It's the biggest business conglomerate in Myanmar. It's involved in everything. So this kind of set into motion a series of events that led to this coup on the 1st of February 2021. So the military had rejected the results of the November 8th, 2020 elections. And they were saying that there was massive rigging and, they kind of like what Donald Trump was saying in the US, like the results were stolen and that kind of thing. So they tried to build that narrative. And then the day Parliament was supposed to open with the new lawmakers, that's when the coup happened. And basically, the military has always had this kind of, strong relationship of controlling the country. And over the last few years, the country made it clear it was moving away from the military through democracy, from what we've seen in their voting. And that spooked the military. And then they came in and that's where we are now. And, why it's concerning, apart from the massive humanitarian disaster, that this is, which alone I feel personally should warrant some sort of intervention or some sort of help for the people in Myanmar. But apart from that, we're talking about Southeast Asia, and Will, you mentioned about how important this region is in a lot of your presentations, right? Especially emerging. If we have insecurity in Myanmar, which is one of the major, geographic and important places of Southeast Asia, that spreads across the whole region. And that's what we've been seeing since the military coup. There's been an increase in massive drug seizures across the region. There's been more insecurity, more crime, more of that. So all of this is spreading, and it won't be confined to just Myanmar.
You know, Uday, again, I want to go back to the article. This is something quite interesting. You mentioned that this country became independent in 1948, but meanwhile, in the article, you refer to another group which is called Burma Military, and this is what you wrote, and I quote. You say the military has been referred as the Burma military, and the Burma are the largest ethnic group dominant in the central Myanmar, while the country has over 135 ethnic groups. Uday, for some of us who aren't familiar with the military influence, number one, who are the Burma military? And number two, how big influence are you talking about in this article? So in other words, how concerning is the influence regarding this Burma military? What do you say to that?
Right. Well, so firstly, who they are. So after independence, Myanmar was trying to find its feet, and at that time, so Myanmar is one of the most ethnically diverse places in the region. Like you have, when I say there's over 135 ethnic groups, those are conservative estimates. There could be a lot more, and these are smaller groups. And because if you look at the borders, you have, Thailand there, you have, China. You have a lot of mixing of people. You have Laos over there. So it's always been ethnically very diverse. And after independence, the majority in Myanmar is the Bamar ethnic group. And they're mostly, if you look at a map of Myanmar, they're generally in the more central kind of areas, the borderland areas. That's where the ethnic minorities are. So after independence, what happened was, different powers tried to come into play, and that's where Aung San Suu Kyi's dad, he was one of the founding fathers, right? So they tried to set up a country, and in the post-independence era, this was very new, and it was happening across the world, right? So it was that kind of situation. In that, some of these ethnic groups, they started to see that, even though we are a part of Myanmar, we're not treated as Myanmar, the majority bombers are. And by the time, so the military took over in a coup, right? And Myanmar was essentially an isolated dictatorship for decades. In that time, when you ask about the influence, the military has basically put itself into nearly every aspect of society, from controlling education to controlling the economy completely. They have two conglomerates, which are the biggest business conglomerates in the country, and they're both held by the military. They're involved in pretty much everything that goes on, and they have this idea that they are the only ones who know what's best for Myanmar. So that's how they've treated the people of Myanmar, as their children, and they are the guiding parents. And we know what's best, like, don't question us, that kind of thing. So they've kind of built up a cult kind of thing like that. And there were times you couldn't question the military. Even now, you can see with the revolution and everything, but you couldn't question the authority of the military. It had put itself into, propaganda is being taught at schools for children at very young ages. This is for the majority bomber population. The minority is being kind of assimilated, or the military is launching operations against them or fighting, and that's when the insurgency really started in Myanmar. So people talk about, the civil war just started in 2021. No, the civil war has been there since the 1950s and 60s. What has happened is it's intensified and spread across the whole country now.
Well, but Uday, again, I want to bring Aung San Suu Kyi into our conversation. By taking away this leader, or by arresting Aung San Suu Kyi, again, she is not just a figure in Myanmar. She's a well-known representative among the international community. So my following question is, by arresting her and putting her in jail and call her this illegitimacy, what kind of message did that send to the citizens in country? So in other words, did every single person believe that the election took place was illegitimate? So in other words, there has to be something done, and then which can be done beautifully only by the military. That's number one. Number two, you mentioned that you can't go against or rebel against the military. And also, right now at this moment, they're not just military group, and they are armed militaries. You are the expert. Help us to understand from the second perspective, how fatal and devastating are the weapons or are the artilleries under the military? Is that really this life and death situation for average citizens if they were to disagree with the military? What would you say to that?
Thanks, Will. So the first part of the question referring to Aung San Suu Kyi. So basically you're asking, do enough people support her? Was there grounds for the military to do what it did? There's no grounds for the military to do what it did at all. If I remember correctly, in the 2015 elections, her party won about 60% of the votes. In the 2020 elections, it won 80%. So that's also like massive supermajority, right? And Aung San Suu Kyi, she was jailed by the military in the 1980s and 1990s. She was under house arrest and all. She was coming up as, a young democracy, like as a democracy activist. And that's how she became famous, as a champion for democracy in Myanmar. So regardless of, her misgivings and what the international community criticizes her about the Rohingya and all of that, yes, she does have her problems. But to a lot of people in Myanmar, she has been the symbol of, something other than the military. And this is a symbol of democracy and, that. So she does retain a lot of influence. And, the military is arresting her, but everyone knows those charges aren't real, that kind of thing. And people want her released, and she still has a lot of influence and power in that sense. Yeah. So I hope that answers your question.
Sure, you did. And what about the second one regarding the military who are armed and also with weapons? And can you help us to dig a little bit deeper on that one? Because we know that articles that appeared one after another and regarding their presence, and they're not just the using the words to warn people or to scare people away, but also they have something much more fatal demonstrated to the average citizens. So walk us through, what about that process?
Okay, so before I go into more specifics about their tactics and, some of the type of industries that they have, if we look at the history of, political activism in Myanmar, whenever there has been a kind of anti-government sentiment, which essentially means anti-military, right? Because the military has been in power. There was quite a large uprising in 1988. It was called the 1988 Revolution. And at that time, like people, because of the economic issues and other issues against the military, they kind of, started protesting, and there were widespread protests and all. And the military used force. The similar scene happened, I think, around 2007. People protesting against the government again, and the military used force. So they've always had this habit of, crushing any kind of dissent or repression or any kind of voice against them. Like media wasn't open in Myanmar for a very long time, and now after the military coup, it's trying to stop information coming out or only put propaganda out. So it's always been a military that has never been able to listen to any sort of criticism and all. So when it comes to now going to 2021, the military took over on the 1st of February. At the start, there was no violence, but people started protesting. Those protests got bigger and bigger. And then it was the military who started, opening fire and cracking down on peaceful protesters. So their knee-jerk reaction is always violence and forceful suppression. Now, if you extrapolate that to, people actively fighting a resistance, they're going to try to suppress that even more. And that's where, some of his tactics, one of the infamous one is called the four cuts tactics. Four cuts. So this was developed in around the 1960s. when the military would be fighting some of the ethnic groups, which started getting stronger, and they managed to get some weapons, and they started to represent their own ethnicities. So that conflict was happening for a long time, right? So the military developed this tactic to basically try to cut an ethnic armed organization from support from the local populace and from to stop it, to allow it to operate. That's what it is on paper. What it actually is an attack on the people in an area. Because what it means is whenever the military has done these four cuts kind of things, it means like hundreds of thousands of people are displaced. It means there's massacres, entire villages are killed or burned. There's indiscriminate arson, violence. There's a lot of sexual violence also. Villages and fields are burned, etc. And we really saw a lot of this happen in 2017 with the Rohingya crisis at that time. When people talked about the brutality of the Myanmar military, this is something that they've been practicing over decades. And now the difference is now they're extending this to all the population, not just, the ethnic groups that fought against them before or that kind of thing. So in terms of the tactics, like the tactic is basically like kill any kind of support for the groups, and if that involves killing the people around, kill them. And now, because the Myanmar military is so rich and it has been entrenched in the economy, right? And because a long time it was isolated, it was criticized by a lot of countries in the past for its repressive actions and that. So because of that, it started developing its own domestic arms industry. And that's a pretty high-tech, well-developed industry, because they're building armaments that they know they have used in their own settings, in their own and they rely on their own supply in that sense. Yes, they do have some foreign weapons, and yes, they do rely on, some information or components from other countries and stuff, but they do have a very developed defense industry. That's why, in terms of the resistance right now, the resistance doesn't have any arms as compared to what the military has. And it has, from planes and aerial assets to, every small arms and So
brother,
it has a lot of resources.
Brother, it's interesting that you kept on emphasizing the word resistance. And of course, we know that what took place in Myanmar sent a wide message nationwide or worldwide. Everyone was following what happened in this country. Now, my next question might sound silly, but I still want to ask on behalf of our viewers and audience. Comparatively speaking, if the resistance movement seems so insignificant, why bother even continue to fight against the military coup at this moment? So in other words, again, in this article, you listed a girl, and again, she was 19, but she was killed, during the resistance movement. Of course, number one, our compassion and again, our prayers went to with the families and also all the victims who joined the resistance movement. But on the other hand, what was the point of doing that? Because we know it's sort of saying you are using the egg to hit the rock, and you are going to fail, and you are not going to win the battle. But why the younger generations, or why the people continue to join the resistance movement, and what message did that send from the resistance movement?
Well, that's an interesting question. Okay. As for, yes, it does seem like this is a David versus Goliath kind of thing, right? With the military on one side, with so many resources and access to all this weaponry and control and money, versus a resistance on the other side, which doesn't have so many arms, is not as unified. It's relying on donations mostly. That's right? So why bother? I mean, I think the people of Myanmar answered that, when after the coup, they didn't stand down. They said no. And for them, life under the military, they've spent decades under that. And, for people coming up now, they don't want that. And what the military miscalculated was the extent of how much people would resist. That's what they didn't expect, and that's why this resistance is significant in itself. Because even though the people might not have the arms that the military has, they have more of a resolve than the military does. And I think if you look at some of the insurgencies that we've seen across the world, not to compare Myanmar, the resistance with the Taliban, for example, but an insurgent actor with a resolve will fight off and persevere against a stronger, well-equipped actor that isn't necessarily, So in that sense, I personally don't think it's like the military is not as strong as it makes it out to be. What we're seeing now is that the military is slowly losing. The key thing is it's slow, and the slower it loses, the more people get killed. Right?
Right.
So yeah, I think the people don't want to live under the military anymore, and I think it's as simple as that. That's why there's the resistance.
Well,
because they are despots. They are,
yeah, well, I agree with you, brother, because again, it's hard to imagine that how people in Myanmar today are actually suffering because of the ruling from the military. Now, I got two more questions before letting you go, and I'll stay with me. Now, Uday, again, as we mentioned in the intro, Myanmar is one of the strategic countries in Southeast Asia. And at this moment, now when I say at this moment, which means in the year of 2023, on one hand, everyone is paying attention to the war in Ukraine. And also, throughout the war in Ukraine, people around the world begin to understand the role of Vladimir Putin and also, the position of Russian government. But meanwhile, I want to ask, what is happening today in Myanmar? How does that shape its image, particularly to the countries in Southeast Asia? Because we know that, again, everyone is watching. How much do you think the military took over, and also the suffering of the people today, and also the resistance movement, that really portrays the distorted society, or even for the future impact for the country of Myanmar? Can you comment on that one?
So as for what the military doesn't care about what anyone thinks of it, as long as it can make its money, as long as it holds its control. Like Myanmar historically has been isolated diplomatically in over the decades, and the military has been fine with that. They were forced to kind of come out of isolation because they couldn't manage the economy anymore, and there were other problems. But they were forced to. It's not that they wanted to. They're very happy maintaining full control. They don't care about what any of the countries say. That being said, within Southeast Asia, for example, within ASEAN, Malaysia and Indonesia are trying to push for harsher measures against Myanmar. But Myanmar's more immediate neighbors, such as Thailand, that holds a closer relationship with Myanmar, as do all of Myanmar's neighbors. Even that way, India, for example, the Indian government is helping the Myanmar military with some anti-insurgency stuff along the border areas. In Bangladesh, they don't want to say anything too strong against the Myanmar government because 1 million Rohingya are sitting in refugee camps in Bangladesh, and Bangladesh cannot handle that. It's a lot of cost, right? Now Thailand's interesting because Myanmar and Thailand, the generals used to share a strong relationship. And what I think happened in 2021 is that the generals in Myanmar, they wanted to kind of recreate what happened in 2014 in Thailand when the military took over in a bloodless coup. They installed a government, a caretaker kind of government for some time, and 2019 held its first open elections. But the military is basically in power now through democracy in Thailand. So I think what Myanmar was trying to do was that, but it failed to understand the extent of how much the people hate them there. So these are with the countries around it. Meanwhile, there's also, China's a very important player in Myanmar. It has a lot of economic interests in Myanmar, and Chinese envoys recently went to meet some of the ethnic armed organizations in the country to, try to see if there's a way out of this also. There are a lot of interests in Myanmar, and there's a lot of Japan invests a lot in Myanmar, you know. The thing is, like, there's a lot of countries that are condemning the situation in Myanmar, and there's some that are more hesitant to condemn it or don't condemn it. But the countries that are condemning it, they're just condemning it. They're not actually offering any more support than that. And that's the difference with Ukraine, you know, with countries actually pledging like billions of dollars or millions. Like Myanmar doesn't need that much, you know. But that's why, like, yeah, I'm sure you've seen this also, how Ukraine has just taken attention from every other thing in the world. Like, this is still happening, you know?
That's right, brother. Again, I want to wrap up our conversation by asking you a very simple question. 2 years later, we're still watching what's happening in Myanmar today. And I think as an outsider, it's fair to ask the last question is, will Myanmar be ever restored back to peace, harmony? So in other words, brother, what is the future for the country? Because again, right now, whatever is happening within one country, it's not isolated, and everyone is paying attention, and everyone would like to know how to continue to strengthen this economic and political relationship with the country. So again, brother, very simple. Are we going to see any future hope in this country, or are we going to continue to be sorrowful, to be sad about what's happening in this country today?
Okay. I do have hope for the future. I don't think the military will be in power forever. There will be a point where they cannot, and there will be a switch. That being said, the current trajectory we are on, you know, where we're kind of in a war of attrition, where, you know, there needs to be some sort of catalyst to change things. Right now, we don't have that. And the current trajectory, it just means like more and more people are going to suffer. As people, yeah, and you know, countries they want some stability, but the fastest way to stability, in my opinion, is to support the people of Myanmar against the military, and that will, you know, take out this big problem. Because otherwise, they're going to be fighting like this for years to come, and the military will slowly weaken, but more Myanmarese people will die, and in that time, insecurity in the region will also increase. So. Well, I do have hope, yeah.
Of course, brother, it's important that we remain hopeful and positive, not only for the people in Myanmar, but also, again, with a lot more youth, and also they are very active in participating in the resistance movement, and we hope and I pray that the country is going to recover from the devastation, and also realize that democracy is everything that's far more superior than anything else. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to speak to Uday. Again, Uday is one international investigative journalist, and also he's one of the writers for MilitantWire.com. And again, I strongly encourage everyone go online, look for Uday's article and also all the updates. And he's an amazing, talented writer, of course, along with all his cohorts at MilitantWire.com. So, brother, thank you so much for taking your time to join the show, and really appreciate your insights analysis. We love to have you back on the show as we continue to follow the updates, not just in Myanmar, but around the world. So thank you so much for doing this.